Since Silent Hill 2 takes place over roughly 24 hours of in-game time, I like to think of it in sort of segments based on the time of day. And this next part brings us through the sunset and evening part of the game. It also lets us explore another part of South Vale. We get to know Laura a little better. But the most important thing in this segment is you get the most amount of time you're able to spend with Maria, which will largely determine if you get her ending or not. How much time you spend with her, how much you protect her from enemies, and a few other things I'll go into later. Make the most difference in whether or not you get her ending, besides not doing things that get the other endings, of course. Now, we start out this segment going into Rosewater Park, looking for Mary, but there's another interesting thing. I talked to someone in the comments about this, and this is the history of witchcraft cults and human sacrifices in Silent Hill. Now, I'm going to go into that in a later video, but that's probably going to be in one on Silent Hill 1 or 3. Now back to Maria. In the place that James expects to meet Mary, he instead finds Maria. Now, an interesting thing about this is I think most people on playing Silent Hill 2 the first time kind of perceive Maria as being sort of a succubus-like character, where she's a creation of the town that exists for no purpose other than to torment James and to help in sort of sucking out his life energy and his anguish to power the town's spiritual evil energy. And that my understanding sort of evolved over time, and this actually goes into, it wasn't just a ramble on explaining the town and how things work in the last episode. This concept of the fog world being this sort of medium area between our world and the spiritual world, and it being a place where the boundaries of reality and the metaphysical are completely broken down. That sort of, even if Maria begins as sort of a creation of James' torment, she becomes a being in her own right, and as we see, if you get Maria's ending, she's able to leave the town with James. Now, it's hard to get the full perspective on this unless you also play the Born from a Wish scenario. Well, a lot of questions still go unanswered even after playing this prologue episode. It does tell us a lot more about that Maria has her own thoughts and her own feelings and reasoning outside of just being a machination of the town. And it's interesting because we see her in a sort of, I guess you'd say, pupil state, where she has this sort of emptiness and longing for what she doesn't realize at this point is James. And we're not entirely certain if the town, if she has sprung into existence sort of as part of James' version of Silent Hill's fog world, or if she existed as a person in the town in some capacity before this. But you can tell that there's a sort of emptiness to her throughout this chapter, and we find out that she's sort of yearning to make contact with James throughout. But even that being said, she has her own thoughts and observations and reasoning and things as she goes on. And this sort of evolves throughout her story with James, where we learn that it's sort of like she absorbs memories and thoughts from James, and so she can imitate behaviors of Mary because she sort of absorbs James' memories of Mary. And so in this way it's interesting because she's almost a mix of the Greek mythological concept of a muse, sort of mixed with the Jungian concept of the Anima, the female aspect of the male persona. And, oh boy, let me summarize my way out of this quagmire. Basically, what I mean is that Maria she's sort of a being that is created out of James' psyche to be his idea of an ideal woman. So she's the appearance of his dead wife, who he apparently loved very much. But her personality, a lot of people misunderstand and think that Maria is just sort of also an apparition of Mary, or this other side of Mary, which would kind of actually play into the Crime and Punishment parallel. But she's actually more than that, in that she is sort of a being that is created out of James' psyche to be his perfect woman. And so in some ways she imitates Mary's behavior, but we see her go through these sort of stages of development where she learns better how to try and seduce James and get him to choose her over the course of the game, which is ultimately her purpose. As a little side note here, you can actually watch the light go through a sort of transition from sort of a grayer to more of a pinkish hue, and the characters have a sort of pinkish hue reflected on them at this point. This section of the town doesn't have a ton of notable locations besides the ones we actually explore. Jack's Inn is not explorable and just has a save point on the back of one of the cars. But there is another interesting point about what I talked about how I think James actually is a war veteran like Jacob Singer in Jacob's Ladder, rather than just resembling him. And, and that he has a history of violence. And this is an interesting thing. If he sees this pipe sticking out of this car and he's like, oh, I'm going to use that as a weapon, I'm going to beat these things with that. Where I think most of us would just be like, huh, that's odd, and just walk right on by. So the idea that James is someone who has encountered violence in his life and is not a stranger to it, I think is reinforced throughout the game. Now, another one, this is an item that this goes towards one of the endings, which I'll talk about in the final episode. But the interesting thing about the text of this item is that it describes how the Native Americans were actually not displaced in Silent Hill by the settlers. They left of their own volition a long time ago, and it was abandoned several times. Now, this is part of what I talked about in an earlier episode about the original native death cult of Silent Hill, where it was initially tainted by sacrifices and rituals being performed, and that the people left for that reason, because the town started to gain this negative aspect even centuries before the settlers arrived. There's not a ton of interesting stuff lore-wise about the bowling alley, but there are just kind of a couple of funny things about the game's design and things that people don't notice. So when you first come in, I'm sure most first-time players, you turn left and go in the first door immediately next to you that's visible, which of course is the right way to go. But then afterwards, when you see Laura come back out here, you wonder, oh, was I actually able to go out this other door? Nope, it is locked the whole time, and it only opens up once Laura goes back out of it. Funny thing about this room, so you can hear them talking, and by the way, I always thought that pizza looked really good. That was probably the best looking video game pizza I'd ever seen in my life at this point. And I think I just kind of looked at the screen really close. I was like, wow, how did they make that pizza look so realistic? That's so incredible. So, yeah, I was mostly focused on the pizza this scene and didn't hear a lot of the dialogue the first time that I played it. But, come on. I mean, that is some amazing PS2 era pizza going on right there. And it's kind of like the trash bags, the pizza. There's a few things that are ridiculously realistic that'll just kind of blow your mind. But anyway, the thing I was going to say about this room is you hear this one line of dialogue where Eddie mentions Mary's name that Laura was looking for her. And of course you're expected to charge right through the door after hearing that. But if you do hang out for a minute, they don't say any further dialogue. They just kind of sit there and wait in silence, I guess, for you to arrive. But the only other really interesting thing in here in the bowling alley is that there's actually some ammo all the way out here at the end of the lanes. And I think probably just about everyone misses that unless they've read a guide or unless they just take the time to explore this area instead of running after Laura. So you can easily make it through the game without getting that, but I just thought it was kind of funny. I mentioned before that the reason that I'm focusing on Maria in this part of the game is because this part has the most to do with whether you get her ending. Now, a major part of that is because the more time you spend with her, the more likely you are to get her ending. And you can do that by running around with her in the largest section where you have her with you. Or you can kind of just stand there with her. So just find a spot out of the way. And if you're a streamer trying to get Maria's ending, it's easy to just do this. Find somewhere with no enemies, stand there with her, and just, you do that when you have to take a bathroom break or go eat or something. Just kind of plan that for this part of the game, because that's an easy way to get a bunch of time in with her, is in a part where there aren't any enemies around, just kind of stand next to her like so. As we enter the hospital, there's one of those really fun and out there fan theories that I need to mention. And that is the patience theory. And that is that all the major characters of Silent Hill 2, including Mary and Maria, are or were patients in Brookhaven Hospital and escaped years ago. And that has led to all of their individual narratives, and now they've come back to Silent Hill. And this is a really interesting and exciting theory, and it's really fun to think about. Again, it's one I think doesn't hold a lot of water, and I don't really believe much in it because there's so much evidence that invalidates it. But it's exciting to think about this concept that maybe, Mary and Maria are a person that has two very different personality extremes, that James could possibly be the suicidal patient described here, that they all changed their names, of course, as one of the theory stretches, and that Eddie could be one of the violent patients, and so on and so forth, that they are all patients who escaped years ago, and that was when Eddie killed his victims, that James and Mary's sort of vacation was not actually a vacation, but them escaping and managing to steal a credit card or something and going to the hotel. So, well, it's really interesting to think about, and that whole concept that Mary and Maria could really be the same person, and all sorts of things that are fun to imagine from that theory. It doesn't really work, but it is really exciting. And if there was ever to be a movie version of Silent Hill 2, I think that would be a totally awesome interpretation for them all to have been mental patients who escaped several years ago when their sort of memory suppression and replacement started happening. I think that would be a really awesome way to do it in a movie. But within the narrative of the game, you would pretty much have to say everyone is an unreliable narrative, and they're lying all the time, and nothing makes sense, and none of the dialogue at all in the game matters for that theory to really work, because there's so many things that shoot holes in it. But it is a really fun one, and I wanted to discuss it while we're here. Back to our discussion about Maria, this is the first part where we really see her as sort of a mechanism of James' torment. So in this room where she first needs to take a break, and she claims that she has a hangover, but we can definitely see the foreshadowing that she's supposed to be sick, much like Mary was. And the idea here is that it actually has a number of different meanings and suggestions to James and to us as the player. And the first is that, there's no hope that even if he does escape with Maria in the end, that she's going to die of the disease, just like Mary did, and that James is in this never-ending cycle of punishment that he can't escape from, even if he follows that ending of the game. But another part of it is this sort of aspect that I think, again, ties back into James having this sort of, I don't know, sort of a military kind of personality, of where and not just someone who's in the military, but kind of a war hero, someone who in another context was very good at serving in combat, and was someone that, it's the reason all this stuff seems to come naturally to him, of killing monsters. But when he couldn't protect his wife from the disease, he didn't know what to do. And in the end, again, him being this person of sort of extreme will and being very, I don't know what to say, sort of desensitized to violence, he was able to smother his wife to put her out of her misery, as he saw it. And all of this is sort of, it's like he's someone who has the need to protect, and when he's not able to protect, this causes him pain. So this concept that she's going to get sick and that he cannot protect her is another aspect of his torment. And for him to feel the need to protect her, but know on a level that he's not able to, is a major part of how she torments him within his experience in Silent Hill. Now, another interesting part about this, you'll see I just keep going in and out of the room. This is another aspect of getting Maria's ending, is how many times you visit her here in this room where she's resting. So, this is what you gotta do, is a few tedious things to try and get her ending. Now, the reason I'm trying to get her ending, I'll go into this more later, but as I've come to sort of appreciate Maria more as a genuine entity and not just a part of Silent Hill's torment, it's sort of like getting her ending every once in a while and choosing her is like giving her a chance to live and to exist as a being. And although it seems like she's trying to feed off of James in a malicious way, truly she just wants to exist in the only pathway that's given to her. And you kind of develop empathy for her over the course of playing the game a bazillion times. And you kind of feel like you're giving her a chance to exist when you choose her ending, but more on that later. It can seem in this part of the game like Laura pretty much just exists to annoy James and to kind of stymie your progress through the game, but this is an important part of the plot in that Mary really wanted her and James to adopt Laura, and you can kind of see that James is not the greatest parent maybe at the beginning, and his sort of maturing and adapting to sort of be better with children and be less abrupt and sort of have sudden fits of anger and outbursts of shouting at them and all sorts of things that kids don't like. He shows growth through this if you end up getting the leave ending, and it shows it as a progression through the game of James sort of becoming more paternal, and in the end it appears that he adopts Laura as his daughter. So these scenes do actually have some purpose, but it's also just kind of watching James be a jerk and Laura pretty much just torment him, and it almost seems like she is also some demon created by the town. But this is actually just part of that subplot of James becoming a little more parental. Now, a funny thing about the way the hospital is structured in Silent Hill 2, and you probably won't realize this your first time through, but the boss is halfway through, and then the second half, although there are enemies, is kind of a gravy run where you just run around and you pick up a bunch of items and you do minimal puzzle solving and go through some plot, but mostly it restocks you on ammo and things after this boss battle. And it's a little different because what we're used to is usually you go through a normal section, then it transitions to Nightmare, and things get worse and worse. But although the Nightmare Hospital is definitely really creepy, it's not nearly as dangerous as the first half of the hospital ending in this boss battle. And then after this, I hate to say out of the woods because you still have to fight the nurses in the Nightmare Hospital, but for the most part you just pick up a bunch of ammo and health after this, and the environment looks creepy. But I actually, this is kind of weird, I've found the more sort of macabre and creepy environments of the Nightmare realms, I find them fascinating and beautiful now, so I actually consider this part after this boss battle as sort of this, I don't know what you'd say, it's like a cakewalk scenery run through the very cool looking Nightmare Hospital. So that's just kind of me, but you'll notice that when you go back through this game multiple times, that at this point there's not actually a lot of challenge until you get to the Historical Society later. I do want to point out at the end of this boss battle, as I do with a lot of the theories where they kind of grew from one thing that inspired people, and then an entire fan theory and all the other pieces of evidence were drawn in from there. This sequence right here of James being pulled on the gurney and hearing the whispering of Mary's voice, this segment is the whole "you are or were a patient." That's where that comes from. And all of the other parts of, oh, well, what about Eddie? And what about Angela? Oh, they all must have been patients. All that came from just this one segment is where people started speculating from. When we return to the room we left Maria in, not only is she gone, but also we hear this sort of breathing sound. And we do also see the medication, which in the English version, James asks if Maria is sick too. But I believe in the Japanese version, he says this is the same medicine that Mary was taking. And it's just sort of more wrinkles to that, hey, if you didn't get the foreshadowing in the earlier part. But the breathing, now, this is a trick that's used a couple times in Silent Hill. And I'll probably mention that in the future. But we're shortly reunited with Maria, and we find out that for now, she's actually okay. But she's gone through a sort of chrysalis stage, is what seems to have happened, and after interacting with James, she's now better able to sort of twist him towards her and manipulate him to choose her and protect her, rather than going in one of the other directions he might have gone. So you can see she does a sort of outburst of emotion designed to sort of get James back on the hook. And you can kind of actually see this is done really well by the way her eyes move and the way she seems to be sort of gauging James, that she is trying to sort of gauge his reaction, that this is something that she's trying on. And the more that we know about her character, we understand that she's not actually some seductress in her 30s as she appears, who, has a long experience of doing this. She's a being who only recently came into existence and is, learning this as she goes. So, well, she just kind of, smiled and winked at him a little bit before. Now, after interacting with James and sort of absorbing some of his memories and personality, she does this sort of outburst to sort of get him more determined to look after her after he just sort of left her in the room. Now, once we have Maria back with us, we mostly just need to solve another really simple puzzle. And as soon as we do this and Maria helps us open the refrigerator, we're pretty much ready to move on, and there's not much else to this segment. Now, one other fun thing is in the ongoing references to Walter Sullivan, we get this elevator game show thing, which it's really just connected to opening up an item box that you get some extra ammo and health items from. But it's, as we know later, that it's actually a reference to a storyline that would be explored entirely in Silent Hill 4: The Room. So it's a fun little part of the game. After that very brief sequence of events, we find ourselves in this sort of twisting hallway where Maria has her first symbolic death at the hands of Pyramid Head. Now, it's interesting because from Maria's perspective, it's hard to tell if she experiences these at all or if this is just something that James sees, because she seems to have no memory of these deaths. Or it could be that she just chooses to block these from her memory because her existence is this cycle of yearning to be with James, finding James, trying to convince him to stay with her, and then being murdered by Pyramid Head. It'd be pretty easy to want to block that out of your memory. But that's left unclear as whether these parts are just something that James is pretty much just standing there twitching while he's experiencing this, and Maria disappears and goes through these sort of chrysalis stages where she becomes better suited to seduce and entice James. But from her perspective, that's what's happening, where they just get separated. She has some time to think and reflect and meditate. And from James' perspective, he sees her killed horribly. And so I'll go into that a lot more in a later episode, but it's interesting how they each perceive this completely differently. I'll talk more about this in the endings chapter when I talk about Maria's ending, but I've grown to think of Maria more as a being that her only path to existence is through James. And like any living creature, she wants to learn and grow. And again, her only path to that is through James and his memories and his experiences. The more she's around James, the more she sort of absorbs from him. And that's how she grows as a living being. Now, you might think that that's an absolutely pathetic existence, but the realization that Maria is just a living thing that wants to exist and doesn't want to cease to exist if James just leaves with Laura or does one of the other endings, it's hard not to empathize with her. And when I made that switch of understanding that she was a being with her own desires and who just wanted to live and exist and grow in the only path that was given to her by her existence, I developed an empathy for her. And so again, that's why I get her ending every once in a while, because I feel like even though it's all fantasy and it's just a video game, I'm giving her a chance to exist on a level. And that's come to sort of have some meaning to me besides just, trying to get achievements or fill out a file and get every single ending. So again, I'll go into that more later, but that's sort of my take on Maria, and I wanted to focus on that in this part of the game. As we close out this segment, a funny debate on this is whose handwriting is that? Is that Mary's handwriting style? It actually appears to be James. It's James' own handwriting as he is tormenting himself. So just a funny little tidbit there. But next will be our darkest, most literally and figuratively episode covering the Silent Hill Historical Society / prison. And then hopefully the final episode, I may have to split it into two, will be on the hotel and the endings. So stay tuned. More episodes coming up as soon as I manage to get them done. Thank you for watching. This has been my guided tour of Silent Hill, Part 3.